ground because of the rain, still a living and non-living. So what would be the interaction? What interaction could a worm have with a living thing? A worm eating an apple or feeding off an apple? Yeah, good. So most of y'all just listed interactions that we know as predation interactions. Predation just means that one organism gets captured and eaten. The predator is the one that kills and eats another organism, and the prey is the organism being eaten. A lot of people think that predator-prey relationships are only with animals, like one animal eats another animal. But when you guys talk about the deer eating the grass, the deer is still a predator, and the grass is a prey. It just can't get up and move and defend itself. So predator-prey relationships are just where one organism kills and eats another organism. So you guys have two definitions on this slide. So get those down. Predator kills and eats another organism. The prey is an organism that's being eaten. All right, so we kind of got predator-prey relationships down. What are some other relationships that we might see, maybe between two of the same species? What would they be doing? All right, so they might have to compete for mates so they can reproduce. Good. So that's our next interaction, competition. All right, before we get to competition though, so in populations, if there are a lot of prey, what happens to the predators? Would that population increase or decrease? There's a lot of prey, so a lot of prey. Up here for prey, yes. All right, so we would also see an increase in the predators. All right, and so predator, we have what's called predator prey cycles, where we see that as a population of prey increases, so does the population of predators. But there comes a point where there's so many predators that they start to run low on food again. And so what we see is a dip in the prey population, which in turn causes a dip in the predator population. So it's just a cycle. And this is how ecosystems naturally have population control. All right, and so ecosystems each organism occupies only a small part of each ecosystem. And so that place where they occupy is their habitat, the area where the organism lives. And the habitat is going to include both biotic and abiotic factors. And a habitat is going to be different from a niche. What's a niche? Have y'all? I know y'all have heard that word before in this class, but when y'all have heard it, what does that refer to? Or niche? I call it a niche, but some people say niche. All right. It could change under different pressures, but it, it's not like they're gonna get up and move, or it's not like so it's not gonna change as easily as a habitat could change. What's a niche or a niche? Sound like you were thinking about it. All right. So the niche is the role that the organism occupies in the environment or in that ecosystem. So the niche not only includes the habitat, it also includes whether or not the organism is a predator, a prey, a herbivore, a carnivore, a producer, consumer. It includes many aspects. It includes, who do they live with? What relationships do they have in the environment? And so one of those relationships would be competition. Competition is when organisms have to fight for resources. And a resource is anything that's necessary to survive. There's two types of competition, interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. So in this one, you guys have interspecific. And that's when organisms from different species, organisms that are different species compete with each other. And I didn't write that definition correctly. So that's when different species. So instead of organisms, just put different species. So different species compete with each other for available resources. So can anybody think of an example of that? Lion and they might compete for space. Yeah. So a lion and an elephant might compete for the same watering hole, for the same space. What else might be an example of competition? Interspecific, two different species. Huh? Snake and elephant? What would they be competing for?
Yes, they eat.
Well, elephants eat mostly plants. Snakes don't really eat plants. They're territorial, so they might also compete for territory in space. Yep. A bear and a wolf, they might compete definitely for same space, same food. Good. Yep, that's my example actually. Um, it is. Um, so a lion and a hyena is my example that I have, that Ayana also presented. They actually compete for food. So they might compete for the same food sources. They might also compete for territory. So one thing about competition, though, is somebody has to win, somebody has to lose. Um, they can't occupy the same niche for the most part. So that's called the competitive exclusion principle. No two species can occupy the same niche at the same time. So like the lion and the hyena, they're gonna fight, but one's gonna win, one's gonna lose. So then what happens is the one that loses usually has to go find another habitat, and it might just be a temporary situation. They'll come upon the same food source again and fight again and start the whole process over. But when there's competition, somebody has to win, somebody has to lose. They can't occupy the same niche. So some species have actually learned to live together and occupy different habitats, um, but within close quarters. So an example of that, is the warbler finches or warbler birds that actually live in, a specific tree. They can't all live in the same part of the tree, so they all have like a certain part of the tree that they prefer. So the Cape May warbler is going to live at the top of the tree. The bay-breasted warbler is going to live like the midsection, and the yellow-rumped warbler would live at the bottom of the tree. And we can assume that they have different, parts of that habitat. They might also have different times that they reproduce. They might also have different food sources. So then now they've varied their niches so much so that, they're no longer in direct competition with each other. Sometimes you just can't help it though. You got to fight. So intraspecific species, intraspecific competition happens within the same species. Yes, same species compete for resources. So like mates. So like when we talk about behavioral isolation with evolution, um, some species they always have that big fight between those alpha males for the females. The peacocks, the males with the biggest, brightest plumage or the biggest, brightest feathers, they're gonna win. That's intraspecific. Like that can't be helped. That's evolution. So they can't resource partition in this case. They only have to have, the best fitness, the best chance to survive and reproduce. All right. Sometimes species live very closely together and they form these relationships called symbiotic relationships. We know this as symbiosis. And we've talked about one of these quite a few times. We've talked about mutualism quite a few times. Actually, we've also talked about parasitism, quite a few times. But basically, when two species live close together and they develop some type of relationship, that's called symbiosis. Some of these relationships are good, some of them are good for one party and not good for the other. And then some of them are, um, good for some, the other ones are not effective at all. All right, so mutualism. Mutualism is a symbiotic relationship where both organisms are going to benefit. And the one that we just recently got over talking about was the lichen. The lichen is a combination of organisms. It is a fungi and it is a photosynthetic organism, such as algae. The fungi provides the moist habitat for the algae, and the algae provides the food source for the fungi. So they both benefit from having a relationship with each other. Pollinators and their and the flowers that they pollinate. The pollinators get a food source. The flowers get to reproduce. So that's another good example of mutualism. Can anybody else think of any examples of mutualism where, huh? Humans and who? You have to have two organisms, and both of them have to benefit. Dog and a human, yes. So they provide companionship. Good. So that could be an example. Andrew to Miss Baker in the main office, please. Go to the main office. Yeah, I don't know. Parasitism. Parasitism is where one organism benefits and the other one is harmed. But what's going to be the difference between a parasite and a predation, or a parasitism and predation? Okay. So they stick to you and they depend on you for their survival, right? So does a parasite want to immediately kill their host? Do you think a parasite? No, because it's going to depend on that host for survival. All right. So the difference between parasitism and predation, they both have one organism benefiting and one organism being harmed. But the difference is with predation, one of those organisms are going to die immediately. With parasitism, it could take years for someone to realize that they have a tapeworm. It could take months for you to realize your dog has fleas. It's a worm that gets into your digestive system and it just steals the nutrients from you. So people with tapeworms, they start to lose weight pretty quickly. Um, so yeah, it can take a long time for parasites to be recognizable because they don't want to kill their host. Because if they kill their host, then they could also possibly die. Now, if there's a tick, you know, ticks can survive for a little while without their host, so they won't necessarily die. But they're not gonna try to kill their host either, usually. All right, and the last type of symbiotic relationship is commensalism. Commensalism is where one organism benefits and the other one is not affected. So an example of that is the shark and the remora fish. The shark um, goes in and eats its food, and you know how sharks are; they're kind of messy eaters, and so they leave a lot of scraps. And so the scraps are floating in the water. These remora fish come along and get those scraps, and they get free food. The shark is unaffected. The shark does not get bothered. They don't get helped or harmed by the remora fish, and the remora fish get to have their food source. Same thing with the egret and different types of cattle. The egret is a bird. Sometimes I've heard different types, but cowbirds are another type. But they actually land on the backs of bison and cows, and they eat off the ticks. And so they get free food, and then the bird gets the free food. The cow or the cattle, they actually get free of diseases that could be caused by the ticks. So actually, that one would be better, commensalism. So some of these, y'all, commensalism and mutualism kind of overlap. If the organism is unaffected, it would be more like commensalism. So scrap what I just said. I just said the example I just gave was more mutualism. There is one other one that we don't really talk about in this class, but it is on your worksheet. It's called amensalism. Amensalism is where one species kind of kills another one or hurts another one, but they don't really mean to. So an example of that would be like an elephant when it's walking through a field. It doesn't know about all the little ants and all the grasses that